Be a mix of a little bit of sad news and then kind of impromptu live stream along that subject. Before we get into that, feel free to come on into the Science Center about 7 days a week. Monday through Saturday, we are open 9:30 to 5, and on Sunday, we're open 1 o'clock until 5. So the bad news we're gonna have to start with today is that one of our two leopard geckos, Einstein, recently passed away, and with this gecko passing away, we had to examine some stuff of why potentially the gecko passed, and that has led into the topic I'm going to cover today. Einstein, in the last few weeks, lost a considerable amount of weight and had a lack of appetite or really willingness to move all that much, became very lethargic, and we were keeping our geckos together, and both of them had lost their tails in little scuffles they had, and the tail was not growing back at any noticeable rate on Einstein during this time. And our other gecko also happened to lose weight a little bit at the same time, which is why you may have noticed in the past few weeks we haven't had our geckos out on the floor. And that is simply because we had to follow a good procedure of basically playing it safe. Because if our animals are sick, we need to make sure it's not something communicable to people, and we have to make sure it's something that's not communicable to our other animals. Thankfully, our other gecko is still with us and seems to be pretty healthy, has an appetite, is moving, the tail is regrowing, so generally is basically on the mend, trending towards being better. But today we're going to talk about, well, what happens at a facility like ours or a zoo or another museum when an animal gets sick? So the first thing we're going to talk about is the procedure when an animal gets sick. So the first thing you want to do generally is isolate the sick individual or individuals. You want to make sure that animal is not potentially spreading whatever it has to other animals. It isn't spreading it to guests. And when you isolate it, you can then put it under more careful observation. And you should be making notes of, symptoms the animal is exhibiting, changes in behavior, stuff like that. And you want to take relatively good notes because your next step is going to be doing a little bit of research. You want to compare that to similar sources about the same type of animal that is also sick, and that'll help you compare and contrast what's going on with your animal versus cases where they knew what was making the animal sick. That way you can basically rule out various illnesses and various ailments. And then the last step really is to take precautions. In some cases, if diseases are terminal, probably depending on the condition, either adjust that animal's lifestyle and care so that it has the highest quality of life for the duration of that time. Sometimes euthanasia is required in extreme cases with certain diseases. But generally, going forward from that, if an animal recovers from it, you then, hopefully in your research, learned how this animal caught this illness, and you can do the last, and ideally first step as well, prevention. It's always more effective and efficient to prevent an illness than to treat it. And in some cases, illnesses are not treatable in the case of terminal illnesses. So, we're going to talk about vectors, pathogens, and symptoms. So, vectors are an organism or medium that transmits a disease from one organism to another. So that would be stuff like stagnant water or mosquitoes. They can be another living thing, or some sort of formation in the natural world. It can also be excess piles of waste in an enclosed area, which is frequently in cases in captivity can be a big issue with animals that produce a lot of waste. A lot of waste sitting around, and that can get into the water or food of those animals depending on the species and their behavior. So then what are pathogens? Pathogens are bacterium, viruses, prions, or other microorganisms that can cause a disease. They are parasitic in nature. They will harm the host often. So then symptoms. Symptoms are a physical or mental feature which is regarded as indicative of a condition or disease. in the subject. That'd be stuff like when you're coughing because you have a flu, or when you have a fever. Also, stomach aches and other symptoms can come from that. So the thing I want to talk about with this is there are entire fields of professions to do with diagnosing and treating illnesses. And they are quite complex fields. And that is because, well, the symptoms aren't always going to be the same from patient to patient. Diseases typically have an array of symptoms that can be had, but very often an individual subject may not have all of those symptoms all at once. So you don't get the nice clean list of things wrong, and then you have a very easy answer. Oftentimes, you may have one or two of this list of symptoms prominently. And then, does every disease have unique symptoms? No is the answer. Oftentimes, some diseases share symptoms. Some diseases have the same symptoms as each other's, others have overlap, and with incomplete sets of symptoms displaying in each patient, or different arrays of these symptoms, oftentimes it can be really hard to narrow down what's actually wrong with a patient. And that can go for the medical field for humans or the veterinary field for animals. In humans, we have a great advantage in our medical field. We can talk to our doctors, actually. We can tell them how we're feeling. We can communicate very articulately what is wrong with us. And the more information they get, the better a guess and the better an educated guess they can make when starting a treatment. But they can still get it wrong because of those incomplete symptoms. And when you have an array of things that have the same symptoms, you need to look at what is the most likely of those things, because that is often what is going to be, more than likely. But that can also lead to very rare diseases that have similar or the same symptoms as more common diseases not being treated properly. And anyone who has had a long-running health issue that was suddenly resolved when a new doctor looked at the issue with fresh eyes can tell you it can be quite frustrating to be the subject of, well, the wrong diagnosis due to Occam's razor. But it is something that happens in the medical field. And it's not because someone's a bad doctor. It is because they are being rational and using a very practiced and very efficient method for treatment. In the veterinary field, though, there is the unfortunate thing is that most of your patients can't talk, and really none of them are going to articulate what's wrong with them. A parrot is not going to tell you, I'm having stomach issues. They're not quite as articulate in our words. They often simply mimic them, so you're not able to have that same amount of direct information from the patient. And oftentimes with pets and zoo animals, we don't always notice when an animal started being sick, but we will notice when the symptoms get more extreme. And oftentimes that can lead to late diagnoses on issues, and that can be a little bit dangerous for the animals. So with our gecko, one of the diseases that I think we have ruled out for what happened was Cryptosporidium. Is a microorganism. It is a protist, so it is something that can be pretty bad. But then the other thing is it causes what we call cryptosporidiasis. And the symptoms are diarrhea, stomach cramps, dehydration, nausea, vomiting, fever, and weight loss. Cryptosporidium is a pretty broad family of protists. It can infect, and there are specific types of Cryptosporidium that can affect specific types of animals. It can even be so specific to genuses. I used to volunteer at a zoo that had a type of Cryptosporidium that affected specifically boas. Not anacondas, not pythons, specifically boas. It didn't even transmit to all types of snakes. And this Cryptosporidium, unfortunately, caused the death of those snakes, and they had to thoroughly clean those exhibits and not put snakes in there for another 5 years to prevent those new snakes from getting infected. Cryptosporidium oftentimes lingers for quite a while and is very hard to clean and get rid of on surfaces. But you can see how it can get very specific. Now, the reason we don't think Einstein had this. So, first thing was, his waste, when he did excrete anything, was not diuretic. It was generally solid. When he did move, he was still drinking. and he did not seem to have the symptoms of dehydration we would see in a lizard. He also was not vomiting. It's hard to gauge a fever and nausea in a reptile, but the symptom he did exhibit, and a prominent symptom in reptile care to look for Cryptosporidium, he did exhibit weight loss. But weight loss is also caused by a lot of other things, one of which, unfortunately, being old age. Einstein was a relatively old gecko, and this may have simply been old age catching up to him. But generally, one of the things I would like to say, when you do think you're sick, just to prevent jumping to conclusions and such, yes, do your own research so you know what could be wrong, but also don't jump to conclusions, and please consult an expert. The veterinary field and the medical field exist for a reason. There are people whose entire careers are made up of diagnosing and treating diseases, and they are very good at their jobs. Yeah, so unfortunately, sorry that was a relatively a bit sad live stream. I know these are normally a bit more energetic and happy. The unfortunate bad news about Einstein is not something that we want to treat lightly, but our other gecko is currently on the recovery. They are gaining weight, the tail's regrowing. Hopefully, we'll be able to figure out what exactly happened, why that gecko lost weight, and why they gained weight again. And hopefully, we'll be able to have that gecko back out on exhibit when we